The gospel reading this morning is from Luke 15, 1-3 and 11-32, and it is the parable of the prodigal son. One day, when many tax collectors came to listen to Jesus, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law started grumbling. "This man welcomes outcasts and even eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to him, "Father, give me my share of the property now." So the man divided his property between his 2 sons. After a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property and left home with the money. He went to a country far away where he wasted his money in reckless living. He spent everything he had. Then a severe famine spread over that country, and he was left without a thing. So he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out to his farm to take care of the pigs. He wished he could fill himself with the bean pods the pigs ate, but no one would give him anything. At last he came to his senses and said, "All my father's hired workers have more than they can eat, and here I am about to starve. I will get up and go to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired workers.' So he got up and started back to his father. He was still a long way from home when his father saw him. His heart was filled with pity, and he ran and threw his arms around his son and kissed him. 'Father,' the son said, 'I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son.' But the father called to his servants. 'Hurry,' he said, 'bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Then go and get the prized calf and kill it, and let us celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, but now he is alive. He was lost, but now he has been found.' And so the feasting began. In the meantime, the older son was out in the field. On his way back, when he came close to the house, he heard the music and the dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come back home,' the servant answered, 'and your father has killed the prize calf because he got him back safe and sound.' The older brother was so angry that he would not go into the house. So his father came out and begged him to come in. But he spoke back to his father, 'Look, all these years I have worked for you like a slave, and I have never disobeyed your orders. What have you given me? Not even a goat for me to have a feast with my friends. But this son of yours wasted all your property on prostitutes, and then he comes back home, and you kill the prize calf for him.' 'My son,' the father answers, 'you are always here with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be happy because your brother was dead, but now he is alive. He was lost, but now he has been found.'" How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. The author of this poem is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I happened to find out she was born this day in 1806. Well, a childhood accident caused her to lead a life of semi-invalidism before she married Robert Browning in 1846. But there's more to her story. In her youth, Elizabeth had been watched over by a tyrannical father. When she and Robert were married, their wedding was held in secret because of her father's disapproval. After the wedding, the Brownings sailed for Italy, where they lived for the rest of their lives. But even though her parents had disowned her, Elizabeth never gave up on the relationship. Almost every week, she wrote them letters. And unfortunately, not once did they reply. After 10 years, she received a large box in the mail, and inside Elizabeth found all the letters she had written to them, and not one of them was opened. Today, those letters are among the most beautiful in classical English literature. Had her parents only read a few of them, their relationship with Elizabeth might have been restored. Reconciliation. It's an interesting word. In the realm of finances, reconciliation is making peace with the numbers or a statement of figures. And sometimes it can be very frustrating, tell me. In the realm of human endeavors, reconciliation is making peace with or within people, bringing conflicting and divergent things together so that they balance. Sometimes reconciliation is internal, realizing that there are many things you can or cannot do with your life. Reconciliation can be personal, as when we restore a friendship and bring harmony to a relationship, especially like what happened between the father and son in today's gospel reading. Reconciliation can be communal, as when countries or congregations or even communities work out their differences. There would be no need for reconciliation if there was not the reality of brokenness. Whether it's the story of the prodigal son, whether it's about our families, or the global political scene, we know that brokenness is very real. God calls us then to be more, his call is more clear now. As a community of faith, we are, as in Paul's words, ambassadors of Christ, called to live out a ministry of reconciliation in whatever context we find ourselves. Luke's story of the parable of the prodigal son is one of the most familiar and loved of all the parables. This is probably because it's so easy for us to see ourselves in it. We can identify with one or more of the characters. Unfortunately, the prodigal son is also an all too familiar story of family estrangement. The reconciliation that takes place as the story progressively moves through the several characters and scenarios is attempting to balance values and life choices. We start, of course, with the young son, intent on getting on with living his life. He takes what would be due to him if on his father's death and moves out into the world. In the midst of his enjoyment and extravagance and frivolity, he must reconcile himself with the fact that he is unable to make it on his own. His moment of internal reconciliation becomes the substance of an interpersonal reconciliation with his father. There's a sad story about Janice, who was a methamphetamine addict. That's a very hard word to say. She's also a single mother of 2 children, both under the age of 6. Most of the time, she was getting high, or trying to figure out how to get high. And when she wasn't, she was angry and impatient and on the brink of violence. And one day, she found her children eating cookies on the kitchen floor, happily sitting amidst the wrinkling wrappings and the crumbs. And she still hadn't figured out how to get her next high. And the sight of her children doing this totally enraged her. Screaming at them, she picked them up and put them in her car and drove them out into the desert. She opened the door and made them get out. And as she drove away, looking at them in her mirror, watching them standing there, growing smaller and smaller, a small voice filtered through her muddled mind and said, "What kind of a parent are you? Horrified, she turns around and picks up her children and drove home. She then registered to enter herself in a treatment center. And she also lost custody of her children when her parents reported her to the authorities. She came to know, at least in theory, that the path to reconciliation with her children and her parents only comes with reconciliation within herself. Do you think that Janice came to see God's grace and love? I am sure that her parents must have struggled deeply with reporting her to the authorities, knowing this was the only way they could protect and save her and their grandchildren. I have another story. It's a story about an itinerant preacher many years ago who we'll call G.W. G.W. made his living preaching off of trains in the lower U.S. He'd ride a train to a town, preach, get back on the train, and then he would preach to another town. G.W. told the story of one unforgettable train ride. He was sitting at the back of the rail car and noticed a young man who was sitting a few rows ahead of him. The young man had a cardboard suitcase stuffed underneath his seat. He appeared very anxious. He would get up, pace the car for a bit, then sit back down, and he did this about every 10 minutes. Finally, G.W. decided that he would go and have a chat with this young man. So he got up and asked the young man if he could have a seat next to him. And he introduced himself. "Son, my name is G.W., and I'm a preacher. You seem to have a lot on your mind. Would you like to talk?" Well, it was just like opening up a spigot. The young man's life story just came pouring out. Me and my pa, we didn't get along well at all when I was growing up. We'd fuss and we'd fight. Heck, we'd get into it over nothing. One day we were getting after each other really hard. I can't even remember what about. When I said something like, "Well, why don't I just leave?" And my daddy said, "Son, there's the door. Don't let it hit your backside on the way out." I didn't really want to go, but I was so angry I went to my room and I packed everything I could fit in my suitcase, and I was about to leave. My daddy yelled back at me, said, "Son, if you walk out that door, don't you ever come back." And I was so mad I just left. Well, things didn't go too well for me after that. I kept wandering from one podunk town to another, piddling job to another, and I wasn't doing too good. One night I was out drinking with some buddies, and we got this idea to rob a liquor store. Well, we got caught, and I got sentenced to prison. But before I got out, I decided to write home to Ma and Pa. I told them I was in prison and I was about to get out, and I was so sorry for how I left and for what I did. That I'd understand if they never wanted to see me again, but I'd be passing through town. You see, my house is just off the tracks here, about 10 miles ahead. I told them that if they wanted to see me, to tie something white out on the tree. That if there wasn't anything white, I'd just go through to the next town, and they'd never have to hear from me again. Mr. G.W., if there's nothing white hanging on out in that tree, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm at the end of my rope. I just don't know what I'm going to do. G.W. said as they got closer to his home, the young man became even more nervous. Finally, the young man nudged the preacher and said, "My house is right around this bend. Do you think you could go see if there's anything white tied up there for me? I just can't look." So G.W. went up and he pressed his forehead against the window, hoping to see something, anything that was white tied in this tree. And he said as he turned that corner, it was the most majestic sight that he had ever seen. Apparently, the family had emptied their whole house of every towel, of every washcloth, every bedspread, every pillowcase, even every piece of underwear. Everything in that house was out flapping on that tree. It was just a tree of white out in that yard. G.W. called to the boy, "Young man, look." And as soon as the young man caught a glimpse of the tree, he grabbed his suitcase, rushed out the door, and leapt off the train as quick as he could. The preacher said that the last image he saw was that young man dragging his cardboard suitcase up the hill and an older couple bursting out of the house to greet him. My friends, that is a picture of what God's grace is like. The cross that was God's way of emptying heaven's linen closet of everything white so that it would be known for all time that God wants us home. No matter what we've done or where we've been, for us, He is pleased we come home. But continuing on with today's gospel, we are never really sure about the internal workings of biblical characters, but the fact that in the prodigal parable, the father excitedly and graciously did welcome his wayward son home makes you wonder if he never really reconciled himself to the idea that his son was never truly gone. In his mind, the balance sheet was left open. And when he sees his youngest son coming up the road, he doesn't wonder or consider if it's a trick or a manipulative act to get more money. He assumes that things are coming into balance, and he throws a celebration to that end. However, the one character in our story that doesn't seem to be reconciled is the oldest son. Here he is, still in the need of a shower, coming in from the fields after a hard day work, arms folded across his chest, the moral high road, as you'd say. But then when he says, "This son of yours has come back, you killed the fatted calf for him," he cannot even bring himself to acknowledge his brother with a name. He calls him "this son of yours." A sense of unfairness, as you know, can turn venomous rather quickly. He doesn't seem too willing to reconcile with his brother. Perhaps you remember the cartoon strip Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin is a little boy with an overactive imagination and a stuffed tiger. Hobbes, he comes to life as his imaginary friend. In one cartoon strip, Calvin turns to his friend Hobbes and says, "I feel bad I called Susie names and hurt her feelings. I'm sorry I did that." Hobbes replies, "Maybe you should apologize to her." Calvin thinks about it for a moment and then responds, "I keep hoping there's another less obvious solution." We have trouble accepting those whom God accepts because we take God's acceptance for granted and God's forgiveness as our right. Are we much like the elder brother who preferred justice to mercy? We have worked hard for what we have, or so we think. And it's unfair that everyone else should not have to do the same. We have earned God's favor, or so we think, by staying at home within the church. We have merited his acceptance by the good life that we live. So how dare God receive and accept our sinful brother who has returned home saying he's sorry? Perhaps when his brother first left the farm, he had been reconciled then to the foolishness of his brother and to his own importance as his father's only responsible child. But his brother's return changed any emotional balance he might have had. For him, everything was turned upside down, and his relationship with his father, with his brother, and with himself had changed. For him, the work of reconciliation was actually just beginning. So where are we at this parable's end? Are we inside at the party celebrating? are we standing outside with our arms folded, refusing to come in? Jesus will not tell us how this story will end. The father passionately invites the older son inside and pleads with him to join in the welcome. Curiously, however, we are never told what the older brother decides to do. The story ends, but truly it doesn't end. I suspect it wasn't finished so that when we will draw our own conclusions and do what is right. What will we do? Will we RSVP to a party thrown by an unfair God, or will we remain stubbornly outside? In a world where God does not play fair, this parable forces us to make a choice. Who is the real prodigal here? Who is the real waster? From the beginning, Jesus says that this is a story about two brothers. Which one is the authentic prodigal? Which one has yet to come home to the Father's extravagant love? Many of you are familiar with Maya Angelou, and this story is about her. She's an American author, poet, and civil rights activist. She was an active member of Glide Memorial United Methodist Church in San Francisco. She wrote that years ago, when she first came to San Francisco as a young woman, she became sophisticated. She said that that's what you were supposed to do when you went to San Francisco, become sophisticated. And for that reason, she also became an agnostic. She thought the two went together. She said that it was that she stopped believing in God. It's just that God was no longer frequenting the neighborhoods that she frequented. She was taking voice lessons at the time, and her teacher gave her an exercise where she was to read out of some religious pamphlet. The reading ended with these words, "God loves me." She finished reading the pamphlet and put it down. The teacher says, "I want you to read that last sentence again." So she picked it up again and read it this time, and somewhat sarcastically, and then put it down again. And the teacher says, "No, read it again." She read it again, and she was forced to read it again. And then she described what happened. After about the 7th repetition, I began to sense there might be some truth in this statement, that there was a possibility that God really loves me, Maya Angelou. And I suddenly began to cry at the grandness of it. I knew if God loved me, I could do wonderful things. I could do great things. I could learn anything. I could achieve anything. For what could stand against me with God? Since one person, any person with God, forms the majority now. There are many people who are just like her. They think it's unbelievable that God would know me, that God would love me, that God would know my name. Just the grandness of it, as Maya Angelou says, that God would really love me. But that is what the gospel is all about. He seeks you till he finds you. In Christianity, the proclamation is so real that God loves us no matter what. It says we don't have to find our way to God because God has already found his way to us. What is unique is that God seeks us and God finds us. That is why the classical, prototypical Christian experience is, I have been found. I once was lost, but now I am found. The life of faith seems to dance of brokenness and reconciliation with ourselves, with one another, with our world, and most important, to and with our God. Whether it's the youngest son or the father or the older brother or even us, our story tells us today that when it comes to God, the ledger is never balanced, at least not in this life. It's always open to the possibility, to the hope of reconciliation. It seems to be in our court as to whether or not we have the courage or the humility to move into that realm of hospitality and grace that is God's gift of reconciliation. Amen.